a financial transaction which requires the upfront payment of the price to the seller, who obliges himself to delivery of a good with precisely described specifications at a specified date. So the good that is being sold becomes a liability in the dhimma. This is that technical Arabic word for it, the dhimma of the seller. Dhimma is like an imaginary container in which a person's liabilities towards others and their liabilities toward him are placed. And so if somebody's dhimma is mashghula, it's activated, it's occupied, that means that he has some kind of a liability toward somebody else. The basic pillars of a Salam contract are the same as the pillars of an ordinary contract. There's a buyer, or you could call him a capital provider. You have a seller, you have the good being sold, and the price. And so what makes this different from a regular sale is the deferral of the good. And we also mentioned that in addition to ordinary sales, there's a very special kind of sale which involves the exchange of money for money, gold for silver, or one currency for another. We're familiar with its manifestation in the modern era. And these are called Sarf. And they have a very different rule because neither side of the exchange can be delayed. It has to occur spot. If we look at what's the legal basis of Salam, we've referred to this in passing in previous episodes. The verse of debt, verse 282 in Surah Al-Baqarah, states, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل مسمى فاكتبوه. O you who believe, when you deal with each other in transactions involving future obligations for a fixed period of time, reduce them to writing. And the verse then goes on to say, after an intervening passage, it says, وَاسْتَشْهِدُوا شَهِدَيْنِ مِنْ رِجَالِكُمْ فَإِنْ لَمْ يَكُونَا رَجُلَيْنِ فَرَجُلٌ وَامْرَأَتَانِ مِمَّنْ تَرْضَوْنَ مِنَ الشُّهَدَاءِ أَنْ تَضِلَّ إِحْدَاهُمَا فَتُذَكِّرَ إِحْدَاهُمَا الْأُخْرَى. And get two witnesses from among your men. And if there are not two men, then a man and two women who are acceptable to you as witnesses, so that if one of them errs, the other can remind her. Now, just a sidebar on this, the issue keeps coming up about why is the testimony of two women made equivalent to the testimony of one man in this passage. Some people have said that because this verse is talking about business dealings, and women in that era didn't engage in business very often, so their familiarity with the subject matter of what they were witnessing would have been less than a man. And they refer to that final clause in the translation that we just read, so that if one of them errs, makes a mistake, the other can remind her. For me, one of the more compelling explanations of this difference, though, is based on an experiment which I saw on the Discovery Channel. There was a 3-part series on the physiological basis for the difference in temperament and thinking between men and women. So one of the characteristics that they called attention to, difference between men and women in their willingness to compromise in the interest of social harmony. And women have a much greater inclination for this kind of compromise. They showed an experiment that was conducted in Toronto where people were passing by a television camera crew, and they would stop people and point to a tower on the other side of this lake, and they would say, "How tall do you think that building is?" And each time that they would stop people, there would be a man walking and a woman walking, and they'd ask them both to stop, and then each one would estimate how tall that tower was. So they showed a series of clips where actually the man was in on it with the people who were filming. And so he would give these ridiculously high estimates. The woman would say 500 feet, and the guy would say 5,000 feet. And then he would try to coax her to change her opinion. And more often than not, the woman would compromise, and she would say, okay, you know, $750 or $1,000. And then they showed the flip side, where each time that they stopped somebody, the man was unsuspecting, just an innocent participant. And when the woman in this situation would try to coax the man to alter his initial estimate, time after time the man would just say, no, I said what I think, and I'm sticking with it. So that willingness to compromise in order to maintain social harmony is much more a feature of the psychology of women. So if there are two women here along with one man, then the likelihood of their being swayed by that man would be reduced, because of, it's like she looks at her and the other looks at the other woman, and it's like, no, it's not like that. It was something else. So anyway, with regard to this verse, which requires the witnessing and the recording of these debt obligations for a specified time, Abdullah bin Abbas, the great scholar of tafsir of the Quran, the Sahabi, he said, I testify that a good sold with guaranteed delivery at a specified deferred date has been made lawful and permissible by Allah in His book. And then he recited this verse. We're going to take a break and be back, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back. So we're talking about the Sharia evidence for Salam sales. In addition to the Quranic verse, you have the hadith that was collected by Al-Bukhari and Muslim and others, in which Abdullah bin Abbas mentioned that when the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, he found the people doing these transactions where a sale would be made for delivery of dates 2 or even 3 years in the future. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't prohibit that. He allowed it, but he said whoever does that should contract for a specified volume or a specified weight with delivery at a specified date. And there's also mention in, I know it's in Sahih Muslim and also in Sahih Bukhari, where these kinds of transactions were going on between the people in Medina and farmers in Syria, or merchants from Syria. And some from the Tabi'een asked 2 of the Sahaba, they had some kind of disagreement among themselves regarding the fiqh of Salam sales. They referred to these companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and they asked them, when you made these kind of deals, was it specified to be from a particular farm? Did they have a farm, particular farm that they were getting from? And the companion said, we never asked them. Now, there's a narration in the Sunan Ibn Majah that, from an isnad point of view, it's weak, but it has a point in it that scholars agree upon. There was a situation where somebody came to the Prophet ﷺ. He informed him of a tribe that had accepted Islam, but after they became Muslim, their economic conditions became very difficult. They were facing hunger. And this man was afraid that they might say, well, you know, before we became Muslim, we were doing okay, and now we're having all kinds of problems. Maybe it's because we became Muslim. So he was afraid that they might leave Islam. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he turned to those who were there and he said, does anybody have something? In other words, something that can be donated to help these people out. And there was a Jewish rabbi there, and he said, I have such and such. And the narrator said, I believe he said 300 dinars. I believe it was dinars. And he donated those dinars, but it was not donation. He said that what I want in return at some specified date is the dates from the orchard of so-and-so, because probably they were a good quality of dates. So the Prophet ﷺ, he agreed to all the terms, except that he said, but not from any particular orchard. And although this is weak from an isnad point of view, that last point is agreed upon among scholars, because if it becomes specific, then the likelihood that something might happen to the crop of that particular orchard is very possible, in which case it becomes impossible to fulfill the terms of the contract. So the way a Salam contract is structured is that the good that's going to be delivered is generic. You can never have a Salam contract where you say, I'll sell you that item in particular with delivery after 6 months, because something might happen. That item might get damaged or destroyed. And it's not necessary in a Salam sale for the person who's selling the commodity to own it at the time of the sale. It just has to be available at the time when delivery is agreed to. And that's why in the context of 6th century Arabia, 7th century Arabia, the way that that kind of sale tended to work was for agricultural goods. And so these are what are called fungible. A particular kind of wheat, you can get it from here, you can get it from there, and one can be substituted for the other, and no one will know the difference. And in classical times, there was differences of opinion about whether you can have a Salam sale for something like meat. Some scholars allowed it, others did not, because the argument against it was that they differ from one animal to another. And contemporary opinion among scholars is that this is one of those things where the ruling has altered due to changes over time, because the ability to specify the characteristics of goods in our time is much more developed, and so even non-fungible goods can be sold through Salam sales because it's possible to specify them in a way that will prevent disputes. Because the whole issue with specification is that this kind of contract needs to be nailed down with specifications in order to prevent disputes. And it's a matter of consensus among scholars that this kind of sale, the Salam sale, is lawful. What makes it different from a regular sale? Because it involves a debt obligation, then the delivery date of the sold item must be known. The sold item must be thoroughly described. The sold item must be possible to deliver. The price must be known. And as we mentioned earlier, the price must be delivered at the contract session. Because the good must be of a generic type, then you can't have a Salam sale for real estate. Because once you specifically describe the real estate, every piece of land is different. And so once you've precisely described what you're looking for, that becomes a particular piece of land, and you can't have the sale of particular things in a Salam sale. Now, when we talk about the price being known, well, if the price is being delivered at the contract session, then of course it should be known. Why would that even come up? The reason for that is that price could be cash, or it could be goods, or it could be usufruct. So cash, of course, we understand what that means. And something close to cash would be like corporate shares. That could be a price. That could be the payment for a Salam sale. And it could also be commodities. It could be oil. It could be wheat, something like that. In which case, taking possession, the person is not going to physically grab hold of 100,000 gallons of petrol. There would be constructive possession. So therefore, the type of oil and the quantity, all of those things would have to be specified. And as far as usufruct, that would be the issue of it being known would come up in the sense that, well, let's say that the payment in this case is being able to use a house for a certain period of time. So the type of house, the specifications of what it is, the usufruct that's being delivered, that has to be thoroughly described. One way that Salam sales can work is, like a modern manifestation of it, would be where a farmer makes a contract with buyers in the city to deliver merchandise, various kinds of fruits and vegetables to them, specific quantities on a weekly basis, and when these are specified, then that would be perfectly lawful. We come to the end of our time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allahu a'lam.